My lords and visitors, and I hope everybody's now accommodated in the gallery. Our Irish visitors will be familiar with the joke about the London buses. You wait a long time and then two come. And we are hugely grateful to you, Mr. Bruton and Mr. Ahern, for coming this afternoon to us. To have had two former Taoiseach, I think that is the right collective plural, who are prepared to appear before this committee is a great honour and privilege for us. And you have both had most distinguished careers and led your country in some of the, I won't say the easier times, but to considerable success, which has been very much in the interests of the United Kingdom as well as yourselves, and we welcome that. I don't want to take the time of the committee by itemising your various distinctions, but just to say that in your several positions as Taoiseach over the years, you will have had to deal with the British government on some of the most sensitive issues of the developing peace process. And I think we're all very strongly committed to at least preserving through this new situation the benefits of that process. And secondly, and not least, you will have had hands-on experience, in certain cases I think John Bruton, in representing the European Union at the highest level, but both of you in dealing with Council and understanding the machinery of that not always well understood institution, and looking at the feasibility of what we could do. This committee wants to look at the implications for the island of Ireland, both halves of it, in relation to Brexit issues. I can think of no better pair of interlocutors than John Bruton and Bertie Ahern. You are most welcome this afternoon, and we look forward to your evidence very much. In terms of how we structure this, perhaps I'll invite you in that order, John Bruton and then Bertie Ahern, to make any initial remarks you care to, and then we've a list of questions we would like to work through, but to try and to make this session as interactive and informal as we reasonably can for colleagues as well. So if you would like to kick off, John Bruton, we'd be very grateful.
My Lords, first of all, I'm very pleased to be appearing alongside Bertie Ahern. It's probably the first time in either of our careers that we've appeared on the same platform. I would like also to say that, to my mind, and I was a member of the Dáil at the time, the joint decision of the British and Irish people to join the European Union at the same time transformed the relationship between the two states, in the sense that prior to that we were in a sort of bilateral unequal relationship, which had all of the difficulties that go with any bilateral unequal relationship, whether it be in a family or between states or between businesses. But by joining something that was bigger than either of us, we became equal members in some senses of the European Union, but also we dispensed with some of the psychological difficulties that had been preventing us engaging. I've said this publicly a number of times, but the very first time that a British Prime Minister in office visited Ireland from 1922 until 1973 was the year after both of us joined the European Union, when Edward Heath came to Dublin. No previous British Prime Minister had met his Irish counterpart up to that. And I think that symbolised the change in relationship and made all of the things that transpired thereafter, with which both Bertie Ahern and I were involved, possible. So we do, I say for myself, we're feeling a great sense of loss at this time, but we've got to live with that loss and do the best we can.
Thank you, Bertie Ahern.
Lord Chairman, Lords, it is a great honour to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a great honour to be here with John Bruton as well. As he said, we normally were sharing the same Parliament on opposite sides of the floor, so to be here together, I think, on the one constructive issue and constructive line, I hope, is also good. I've been lucky enough through, like John, a long political career of working in the European Union with respective British governments of all sides for a long period. And the great thing about that was, I think it helped to build relationship. As John has said, those relationships were not there previously. I got to know so many ministers in the years I was in the Social Affairs Council as Employment or Labour Minister in our system as ECOFIN, and then in the European Council. And it was really a help for us to be able to know and to change the relationships. I remember the first minister that came over to me, was the Minister for Taxation, was John Cope, and they found it necessary to have about 200 security people to protect them. And by the end of our period, they hardly had any security to protect anybody. So it was how things evolved and how it cooperate. And Europe was a huge part of that. But I spent a lot of my life, as John has, negotiating things, and the reality is we are where we are. And there's no point in arguing about things of the past. I've gave up most of that in my lifetime. It's a futile exercise. So we now have to try and establish what we can do. And like everything in life, nothing is insurmountable if you try hard enough, and it will take effort. Can I also, Lord Chair, just thank the committee for involving yourself in this Brexit UK-Irish relations inquiry, because I think your visit to Dublin and Belfast has been well received, and I think it's been considered very important that you've given your time and effort to examining these issues and giving people a voice where they can explore these issues, and I think that will prove to be very helpful in the months ahead.
Well, thank you. If I might just respond to those opening statements. I'm very grateful for your sympathetic welcome of our inquiry. We did think it was, as it were, the most important quasi-constitution issue, or the most pressing one that we should throw light on as a main committee. And as ever, and this is really my second point, we were extraordinarily well received, both in Belfast but also by the Oireachtas, and that is partly on the back of what you've already referred to, good working relations in the interparliamentary field, which we've enjoyed for many years. I hope we will continue to do so. I should have perhaps mentioned, though you've just made formal statements, that as is self-evident, this is a public evidence session. It will be webcast, and we'll make sure you get a transcript, informal transcript for correction later. I hardly think or anticipate it will come to that. But if I may kick off our lines of questioning, and please feel, whichever of you wants to come in first, do signify. I'm sure you can work it between you. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, David Davis, has identified, in evidence to us and elsewhere, that UK-Irish issues are one of the more difficult elements of the negotiation. And I wondered if you could both indicate what you see as the main difficulties that need to be addressed. And maybe, to save time, either then or subsequently, you might like to say something about whether it's desirable to seek to establish a specific bilateral UK-Irish deal, taking account of the uniqueness of the relationship as a distinctive strand of the Brexit negotiations. Who'd like to go first on that?
Well,
John.
I think as Bertie Ahern will be able to elaborate, as he was involved directly in the negotiation of it, the access to the European Convention on Human Rights is a vital part of the Good Friday Agreement. And while there isn't any suggestion that leaving the European Union would involve necessarily leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, this is a very serious part of the Good Friday Agreement, and I think that needs to be brought to your attention. Furthermore, the fact that we are both members of the European Union there at the moment means that there is effectively no border in terms of a barrier within the island of Ireland, and that creates opportunities for people not to feel isolated. The sense of being isolated, the sense of being, in a sense, disregarded or in a permanent minority, lay behind some of the very aggressive tactics that were adopted by Republicans and indeed Loyalists at times as well. So that sense of isolation it's at some risk of being aggravated by the fact that we will no longer be in the same economic union as we are now. As far as a bilateral discussion is concerned, obviously anything that we do in that regard has to be in accordance with our European Union obligations, as we're a continuing member of the European Union, which means in effect anything to do with trade essentially it will be handled by the European Union authorities. In other areas, however, it is quite possible for us to have arrangements with the United Kingdom on a bilateral basis, and I've no doubt we will try to deal with that. I would also say that the economic effect on the Republic of Ireland of Britain leaving is bound to be negative because of the extent of the trade, which is going to be affected by uncertainty or barriers to some degree or other yet to be determined. And some of the studies that have been done have suggested even that the loss to Ireland of Britain leaving the European Union will be even greater than the loss to Britain of Britain leaving the European Union. But unlike Britain, we had no say in that decision, so that creates clearly some negative feelings in Ireland.
Thank you. That's very clear. Mr. Ahern.
On the trade issue, I think you're aware of this, but to restate it again, I mean, the two-way trade at somewhere between around 55 billion for us is enormous figures, maybe not for large countries. I know some of the articles you read, you can see it put two ways. You can say it's 14% of our exports come to the United Kingdom, but really that's cloaking it with the multinationals. The reality is that it's over 43% of indigenous Irish companies, which is about 85% of the employment in that area. And then I think the spin is very much in the reality area. It is a huge hit. While we have a very strong ICT sector, pharmaceutical, medical appliance and medical supply sector, agriculture and related areas is still enormous. The mushroom story has been well publicised because it's easy to understand, but John and I think, spent our life trying to improve agricultural exports, and it's 50% of the beef, it's 60% of a lot of the categories, it's 80% of some of them. So it's huge percentage of these areas, and the UK market is absolutely crucial to these industries. And the reality is, I hear people saying that you can move on to other markets, but when you're a small indigenous company trying to start, or you're small, or you're family based, or co-op based, it's very hard to do that. Maybe we'll talk about that later. The idea of having agreement, of course, what John said is totally correct. It has to be EU based, but I do think there are many references in the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international agreement, where it is set down that the UK and Ireland, it's in Strand 2, the North-South Ministerial Council, and it's in the British-Irish Council end, where we should work together, and it even says resolve difficulties at an EU level. So these are very important connections, and I think our northern folks in particular would see this as vitally important to how things happen as we go forward. The European Convention is one, but I think it is hugely important that we try to deal with these issues together. I think if we just wait for the whole issue to be at European level, there are some things might be well pushed aside. I was in Brussels recently, and I know a lot of the debate can be about the Scottish debate, so I wish them well, but we have to talk about our side of it. And the reality is that it's very important that the Irish issues are dealt with. And of course, we have to coordinate ourselves on our side. I think it is necessary that we have our own BrExit minister or Minister of State to try to deal and coordinate these issues. And I think that was evident from some of your own meetings last week in the reports I've seen.
Well, thank you both for that. If I may say, I'm struck by the fact that you see, as it were, two leaves to this exercise. One is what you might call the cultural and political, and the other is the economic, and you don't regard those as distinct. They're both two sides of the same sheet of paper, as it were. If I might just come back on a couple of issues and for comment. One is on the economic side. We were hearing evidence across Ireland, both in Belfast and Dublin, about the importance of supply chains, and this was not, as it were, if I can caricature, major international companies who were using you as a production base for, say, the whole of Europe, but rather it was, I think, encapsulated as all the pigs go north for processing and all the milk goes south for processing. That may be a slight exaggeration, although you're nodding, I think you're familiar. Would you like, individually or together, to comment on the importance of supply chains for your economy?
I totally endorse what you've just said, Mr. Chairman. I understand 30% of the milk in Northern Ireland is processed south of the border, and a similar proportion or more of the chicken produced south of the border is processed north of the border. But more extensively, I understand that if you visit a filling station here in Britain or in Northern Ireland or in the Republic, the likelihood is that the bread may have been produced in England, the butter may have been produced in the Republic of Ireland, and the filling may have come from Northern Ireland. The supply chain of the food industry is exceptionally interconnected. Now, if a free trade agreement covering agriculture is negotiated, there will be no problem with any of this. But if we get into a situation where the common external tariff, which is very high in the case of some food products, has to be imposed, that will require us on our side of the border to introduce customs controls of some kind to collect that tariff. On the other side of the border, or here in the United Kingdom, people will have to certify the origin of the various products that they're putting into these into the final product to show that it has originated in the UK and not in Brazil and not in somewhere else, and that the UK-Ireland supply chain is not being used to undermine European arrangements by importing those products into Ireland. So the bureaucratic as well as the tariff costs imposed on the food industry supply chains will be substantial. Similar issues arise in respect of the motor car industry, but that's not so relevant to Ireland.
And Mr. Ahern?
Yeah, I mean, the interrelationship is enormous, and I think we all know just how big the multiples are. I was looking at figures recently about Tesco, and if you just take that one supermarket chain, they are taking huge amount of supplies from the cheese is over 60%, and the poultry is 84%. And of course, as John has said, the two-way trade of milk, and there's $1.5 billion per annum of goods going north-south. Tariffs would, I think, cripple a huge amount of the industry. I can't see how the bureaucracy would certainly be enormous. The amount of people that would be involved in the add-on costs of trying to run that kind of a system. But I think really my concern would be that people would start going elsewhere for markets, and it would really work totally against the entire multiples industry, and that would be a huge loss We've spent probably our whole history, but certainly groups like the Kerry Group are 40 years in existence, and they've built enormous connections between the island of Ireland and the UK generally, and to set up a whole bureaucratic system with high tariffs that would cripple the industry would be devastating.
Well, thank you for that. My other brief point, just really to get confirmation from you, that we will explore some of the legal issues and around the Good Friday Agreement in due course, but I think you both hinted at the fact that there was some concern at the political level of the position, as I interpreted it, of the nationalist, or what is the Catholic minority population in Northern Ireland, because they might, I think you said, some sense of being separation or something like that, because they're not the majority, although they are involved in the power sharing agreement by definition, but they would lose their European citizenship, and while they can still apply for yours, they are somewhat, shall we say, over the border. I mean, that's perhaps a simplistic reflection. Is that the sort of thing that you anticipate people will have in mind?
Yes, it is, my Lord Chair. I mean, I think it cannot be overstated the positive effect for 40 years of being jointly members of the European Union had on changing the mindset in Northern Ireland. In many, many ways that helped over admittedly a long process, a slow process, and through all the various agreements and all the agreement efforts, but they were all on the one road to ultimately get to a position where everyone wanted to get to, and each incremental stage was very important in my view. But our European membership was critical to that, and it made the connection, the point that John made that early on about the physical connection. Like, I think between 1921 and that 1974, I think there were only 2 engagements or 3 engagements between Taoiseachs and Prime Ministers in the whole period. And then all that changed. Then it was ministerial councils and the summits in Dublin, and so the whole position had changed. So I think if people in Northern Ireland, and I think all sides, would see this as a big loss. I mean, that comradeship and connection and personal connection, and like everything in life, the personal relationships are hugely important. So I think there are many people now who are quite pro-European, but weren't so European when John and I were trying to often convince them. But I mean, that's life. But it's good that they've come to that position, but unfortunately they came to the position. It's a bit difficult the way it breaks up at the wrong time.
I just add one thing to what Bertie Ahern has said. I think when the UK leaves the European Union, I think Northern Ireland will be the only territory then not in the European Union where every person living there is by right entitled to be legally a citizen of the European Union, simply by applying for an Irish passport.
Which they can do at a Northern Ireland post office?
Yes, at the moment. And that, I think, suggests that already, even if when the departure of the UK goes ahead, Northern Ireland is special and has some special standing, which will, I'm sure, be recognised in some way.
Thank you. Lord Jay.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. During my Foreign Office career, I think I went to up to 20 European councils with Prime Ministers from Margaret Thatcher through to Tony Blair, and as an official dealing with the European Union, it was often extremely frustrating that as far as the British Prime Minister was concerned, by far the most important part of the meeting was the meeting with the Taoiseach, under the radar and not recorded. But things have moved on from then, and the relationship is different, and as you were saying, better. But I wondered what whether you thought the present sort of structure of relationships between Britain and Ireland, and indeed between Ireland and Northern Ireland, is kind of the right sort of structure for carrying out the rather difficult period of negotiations over the next 2 to 3 years, or however long it'll take. And just one more specific question. I wonder what you thought of the current Taoiseach's decision to establish an all-island civic dialogue on Brexit, and how important do you think that will be in the negotiations over the next couple of years or so?
Well, I think it's very important because it gives people a voice, and there's been a big call from most of the people in Northern Ireland, not everybody. We know the Democratic Unionist Party, Ireland Foster, has not seen this maybe as the best idea, but I don't think there's big disagreements either. I think the view is that people have been able to express their view, and what the Taoiseach is trying to do is come to a collective position where that position can be articulated either to Europe or to your Prime Minister and colleagues of where things are at. So I think there's only good in that arrangement. Your question is that, or what is the best arrangement? I do think that rather than setting up another structure, that the North-South Ministerial Councils, which reference in their makeup in an international agreement that these issues should be discussed at it, I think they should be used. And equally with the British-Irish Council. It clearly states in the document, and a clause put in as if almost somebody knew what was going to happen, which they didn't, that this connection should continue. So I think they should be used. Now, from our side, I do think it's going to be a difficult set of negotiations, and probably if it's filtered through one Minister of State to be able to deal with the issues, I think it would be important, because otherwise things can get lost. And it's not, if you're a Minister for Health or Education, it's very hard to be able to stay across these things. But I wouldn't go off setting up something entirely new. I don't think that's necessary.
I would agree that I think the forum that the Taoiseach has proposed is essentially to give people a sense that they're being listened to, because the sense of shock is quite substantial, and people need to have a sense that they can be heard in a structure, but it's voluntary. Some will not participate in that. But as has been said, the Good Friday Agreement provides for the North-South Ministerial Council, and one of its functions under the agreement is explicitly to consider the European Union dimension of relevant matters. And further, that the views expressed in the North-South Ministerial Council can be represented appropriately at relevant EU meetings. And the effect of Brexit will mean that it will fall to the Irish government to represent appropriately whatever is said at the North-South Ministerial Council at EU meetings, because we alone will be at EU meetings. Not that that's the status we would wish to have, it's the status we will have. Furthermore, I think the North-South Ministerial Council has a responsibility in particular to consider agriculture, which is going to be immensely impacted, to consider relevant EU programmes which will have an effect on one side or other of the border. In Strand 3, which is the East-West relationship, there are two institutions, the British-Irish Council, which brings together not just the two governments here, but the government of Scotland, the government of Wales, the government of Channel Islands, the government of the Isle of Man, and that of Northern Ireland. In that entity probably may need to raise its game a little. It is a rather diffuse chamber, and not always, shall we say, do the main players represent themselves at the top level, which they ought to from henceforth. And the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference is also a very important forum and means for the two governments alone to deal with things. And the Good Friday Agreement requires them to have regular and frequent meetings on non-devolved matters. I think these meetings will have to be more regular and more frequent, using existing institutions to which nobody can raise objection to us doing.
Perhaps I could just follow up with a further question. The Irish Foreign Minister, Mr. Flanagan, said sort of recently that, or suggested that the Irish government should seek, and I quote, a legal recognition of the unique status of the North and the circumstances on the island during the BrExit, or in the part of the BrExit negotiations. And I just wondered what you thought of that suggestion, what exactly it means, actually, and also whether you had any reflections on the defeat last week of a motion in the Northern Ireland Assembly, in fact, while we were in Belfast, which the defeat of a motion endorsing just such a proposal.
Well, I think the reason for the defeat was, again, because there are different views around what the structure should be. I wouldn't worry about it. I think there is a clear effort by the First Minister, Marlon Foster, and Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister to try and deal with the substantive issues as closely as they possibly can. I think that's the main thing. It probably would have been nice if everybody had turned up to the Taoiseach's forum, but I wouldn't over worry about it. I don't know about whether you can have a legal recognition. I'm not clear how you could do that, but I think what Minister for Foreign Affairs is saying that because we're more affected than anybody else, that Europe have to give due recognition to that fact, and the fact is borne out by all the statistics that you need to look at, and that there's special reference to it, so that the entire discussion cannot just be taking place at a European level and ignored it. I would strongly hold the view that that doesn't hold up. I know in the first instance people said everything has to be dealt through Europe, but there is a small matter of an international agreement, yes, which is the Good Friday Agreement, and that says different. So you can't stand that down, whether you'd like it or not. So I think that is the vehicle that allows there to be a relationship. I'm not saying to take over trade matters or trying to debate the common agricultural policy. I'm not talking about the EU budget after 2020, not those issues, but at least that there's due recognition of the substantial turmoil that this can create in so many ways to the island of Ireland.
I just say that the European treaties are full of protocols recognising the particular situation of particular territories. You can think of the references to the islands, for example, and there are numerous others which people more legally erudite than me could cite in those treaties. So a recognition of the special position of the island of Ireland is something, and I think this is an all-island matter, really. It's not confined to Northern Ireland or to the Republic. I think that some recognition in a protocol or in a declaration that recognises these particular difficulties can easily be appended to whatever treaty is finally agreed.
You would see that as something which would refer to the island of Ireland rather than...
Well, personally I would prefer a reference to the island of Ireland. I mean, references to the north, for example, are used only by one community, yes, not by the other, and I think language is extremely important here to avoid causing people to feel that you're not on their side. If you use Northern Ireland, that has another meaning. If you use Ulster, that conveys something entirely different. I think language is exceptionally important in this matter. So I prefer to stick to official titles and to describe people as they choose to describe themselves, ideally, rather than as I might be inclined to describe them from time to time.
And I think, if I may say, the earlier exchanges rather pointed the fact that you both expressed concern about the economic impact on the whole of the island of Ireland. And that is before you deal, as we will do in a moment, with the specific conditions of the Good Friday Agreement and peace process. Lord Green had, I think, a follow-up question.
Lord Gay and I were last week in Paris at the invitation of the French Senate to talk about Brexit and all of the issues. And one of the things that struck us jointly and severally was that the French hadn't really understood the seriousness and significance of the very special problems of the island of Ireland as a result of the Brexit decision. And then I had that underscored again yesterday. I was in Berlin, not at the equivalent, not at the Bundesrat, but at a public session on Brexit with a group of policy think tank types and journalists and others. And the same point occurred to me there, that they haven't understood the significance and seriousness of the problems that Brexit will pose on the island of Ireland. So I wonder whether you would feel that we collectively, both the Republic and the United Kingdom, should be doing more to make clear to the member states as Britain goes into the negotiations just how significant this is as an issue to deal with. They were very focused on the issue of Scotland, and I have to remind them, at least in my view, and I suspect in yours, that the Irish issues are more serious and more complex to sort as part of the negotiation.
I think that feeling in France does no more than reflect the debate that took place in the UK before the referendum, where the impact on Ireland was virtually ignored, apart from a few interventions from the Prime Minister. And I think one shouldn't be too critical of the French if they've been following the referendum here and seeing all these references to Scotland here and very few references to the impact on Ireland. The reality is now that we, and we may find ourselves virtually alone in this, in our government and through our embassies, are going to have to make 26 separate representations, explaining all of the things that Bertie Ahern and I have been referring to here about the Good Friday Agreement, about the interdependence, about the travel area. All of those things are going to have to be explained. And we're going to have to do that. It would have been easier for us, I think, and I have to be frank here, if more thought was given to this before the referendum was initiated. And if it would have been also easier if more thought and a public expression to this concern had been expressed during the referendum campaign. I spoke in a number of events here in the UK, and it was people were hearing references to this, it seemed to me, for the first time, notwithstanding the fact that there's been so much interaction between these two islands, and people on this island are well aware of the negative consequences of failing to deal with certain underlying grievances that it can have for people here and for innocent people here.
Well, if I may say, I think the susurration of laughter around the committee would suggest a certain agreement with your position and comments. Though we will not take a formal position on the part, except perhaps in defending the committee. We might just say that we did put one or two penneth into the debate long before the referendum campaign, because it's been a concern of ours for some time. Lord Green wants to follow up.
I was certainly not meaning to be critical of the French. I was really observing the fact that they don't understand enough of the complexities of this, and I would have thought it was in both the interests of the Republic of Ireland and also the UK to make them more aware of these complexities.
They're your neighbours, in fairness.
Well, I agree with what John has said. I think we both were involved in many campaigns and interviews, and unfortunately, no matter what you said in the interviews about the broader issues, they were all analysed, at least in my case. I've just found they were always analysed back to, was there going to be a customs check on the border again, and was there going to be the free movement of people was going to go, and the wider issue seemed to always get lost. But anyway, that's where we're at. But I think what you said, Lord Green, is the point you made, that we should now collectively work in people understanding the problems and dilemmas and the way forward, I think that clearly is useful, because it is a battle. As John has said, it's not. It is not easy, and I have to say it's not only in the UK but in Brussels and elsewhere. There is a bit of a feeling that they talk more about Scotland. Now I know there's international news channels that do very good jobs, but sometimes we get lost out in that. We don't maybe have the population strength that gets as much focus, but I think it is important that we try to do that in the negotiations. I mean, luckily enough, we are only at the start of the negotiations, and I suppose the first round is going to be the parameters or the framework that'll be between now and the date the letter is sent in. And then the next round will be the details. So there's a lot of time, and I think it is hugely important that we deal with.
Well, thank you for that. I think we'll now get into what you might call the nuts and bolts of the issue. Baroness Prashar.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. My questions are really about hard and soft borders. As you're probably aware, the government here has sought to reassure that there will be no return to hard borders of the past. But given that in reality they will become external EU borders, is there any way of maintaining the current soft border in their entirety?
Well, I give you my view. That's the way I'd like it. I'm not sure what hard and soft borders the terminology means. I have to be frank.
So it's like hard and soft.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. It's not something I'm big into trying to understand either. I mean, I think people say that the hard border equals the past. Is that the hard border that was there during the conflict, yes, when there were towers and huge security and, you know, at one stage over 40,000 people on the security pay bill? If that's a hard border, there's nobody in the world, I hope, wants to return to that. So, but if a border, it's an hour and a half now, thankfully, from, you know, two great cities, Dublin to Belfast. There's a large stretch of a few hundred miles of borders. There's a huge amount of crossroads, 40,000 people a day, or depends who figure you want to believe, work in the south. So there's that huge movement all the time. That's the way I'd like it. Can I quite work out how that will work? If somebody comes up with marvellous technology that can deal with this by technology, well, I'm not brilliant at it anyway, so I'm not going to be the one that invents that. I'd love to think it, but my concern, I have to say, Lord Chairman, is that if the big issue is immigration, how do you deal with that issue? I mean, how can you control a position that if somewhere in Eastern Europe, all the good people in Eastern Europe, if a plane lands in Dublin, they're checked through Dublin with their EU passports. Nobody's any reason to stop them, or the EU passports to come out, and they get on a bus, and in a little over an hour they're on the other side of the border. How does that fit with all that we've heard about immigration? I'm not going to answer it because I don't want to answer that question. I want it the other way, but I do see the dilemma, and it's no good us letting on that there's not a huge dilemma.
Thank you, Mr. Bruton.
Yes, I expect that there will continue to be visa-free travel for holidays and that sort of thing between the UK and the rest of the European Union in both directions. So movement of natives of the UK or natives of Ireland or other EU countries will not be interfered with. What I expect will be the issue will be the possibility that landlords may have to report, or employers may have to report in the UK if the UK chooses to go in that direction. So I don't, having thought about it, I don't think we will have passport controls at the border for that reason, because I think there are many other ways with advanced technology of keeping track of people if that's what you decide to do here in the UK. I think it would also point out that in respect of the common travel area that we presently have, that people who come to the UK and who then go on to Ireland as part of the common travel area, they are checked when they arrive in the UK, just as people who arrive in the United States from Ireland are checked when they enter in Ireland, so into the common travel area. So there are already, if you like, external controls which we would be able to continue, in my view, even though the UK may have left the European Union. On the other hand, the issue with goods, and particularly agricultural goods, will be much more difficult. There, one is going to have, if Britain chooses the WTO option, or having failed to reach an agreement on any better option, finds itself involuntarily with the WTO option, then we will be obliged to impose the common external tariff of the European Union on anything coming into the Republic of Ireland, from Northern Ireland or from this island. And that will mean a much greater expenditure by us of financial resources on customs posts. All of that system, the customs control system that we had, was dispensed with when we joined the European Union. It now is going to have to be reconstituted at substantial cost, and by virtue of a decision in which we were not involved. I know I hear people saying that the Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian model may provide a solution. I understand that, I'm not familiar with it, but that it eliminates duplication in the respect of filling up customs forms. But part of the price of that is that Finnish customs people can go into Norway and examine plots or examine premises in Norway to satisfy themselves that they're being told the truth. Given the particular situation on the island of Ireland, I could imagine difficulties with that, shall we say, for historical reasons. People from HM Revenue coming and inspecting premises in the Republic could be difficult. Likewise, people from the Republic examining premises in East Belfast could be difficult. And that's what they have in the Swedish Norwegian model, which is mentioned from time to time as solving all these problems. That said, whatever is the most advanced technology that's available to minimise the costs, we should get together and use them. And we should pool our resources. There's no point duplicating or triplicating expense. There's going to be far too much extra expense anyway from this, but let's minimise it to the maximum degree.
You may have seen reports in The Guardian that the UK government is seeking to shift the frontline immigration control to Ireland's ports and airports to avoid introducing hard border between the north and south. How do you react to that?
Well, I think John has really dealt with the point. I mean, the difficulties of trying to police that. I quite frankly just find that unbelievable. To put that suggestion forward is a total lack of understanding of how people think, north and south of either tradition. It just wouldn't happen. I think the technology way, if it can happen, is better. But the customs issue and the costs of that, we've already been talking about some of the costs anyway. But if you're to put all of the tariffs issue and then put all of these customs issues, but I have to be frank. I see both sides of the argument in this. I really do. I mean, this is not an easy one. I've said what I'd like to see, but I also see the difficulties for the British government, and hopefully our wise people on both sides between the UK and Europe will come up. Most issues can be negotiated, but really anything other than a negotiated agreement that keeps away from a nightmare.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's a really helpful introduction. I think colleagues will want to come back on some of the details further in a moment. Can I just try a general thought with you to see your reaction? Would it be a sensible approach to go for a solution which was seen as being cost effective rather than the 100% effective in control, where one was prepared to pay a certain price in imprecision either of control of movement or indeed of goods, as a way of doing something which was acceptable? And possibly a subtext to that is the specific issue of security issues. If one is dealing with persons of interest or difficult people, is that better handled by intelligence sharing than it is by physical control? I think you'll get the drift of what I'm aiming at, but I'd be interested in any comments you have on that. Do you want to go first, Mr. Ahern?
I think in matters to do with trade, we're not going to have many options, if the UK leaves the customs union and finds itself in a WTO relationship with the rest of the European Union.
It means
we're not going to have, we will have to do 100% of whatever the EU practice is, not 99, 100. In respect of other areas where there is not an exclusive EU competence, I am sure that we will try to use the margin of manoeuvre that we have as a sovereign state within the European Union to minimise the costs to ourselves and to our neighbours in Northern Ireland and in the UK. As to persons of interest, I don't feel that I can say very much about that.
Mr. Ahern.
I think the trade issues, we all know, reading about trade negotiations in recent days, just how complex they are and how nailed down they are in their detail. So we're not going to be able to do much about that, and we'd have to comply with it. So I just, the point I made earlier, I just hope that the negotiators on the European side, which hopefully are influenced to try and direct them in a way, and I think your point earlier that the efforts to try and do that, but I think the latitude is not a lot. In the free movement of people, maybe it's a bit easier to do.
Thank you for that. Baroness Brown next.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I think I'm continuing on the same theme, so you may feel you've answered some of this before. But if I can move to the common travel area, which existed when neither of us were in the EU, which existed when we were both in the EU. I suppose the question is, how can it exist when only one of us is in the EU? And what would need to be done to ensure it could continue to operate?
I thought initially, I have to say, that this was going to be more difficult to maintain than I now think it will be. If it's just common travel, if it's not to do with working rights to work and all of that. Clearly, the UK outside the European Union will be free to say that it is going to give Irish people, regardless of any other consideration, an absolute right to live and work in the United Kingdom. And I expect we will be in a position to do the same. What we would not be in a position to do would be to discriminate against a fellow EU member's citizens coming to work in Ireland. Indeed, we've no wish to do that, because many parts of the Irish economy only continue to function effectively because of all of the people that have come to Ireland from other parts of the EU. And as you know, we have a larger non-Irish born population as a percentage of our total population than is the case of a non-British population, non-British born population here. And we've accommodated that well. I think that we will be able to sort that out all right. I don't see the EU making particular difficulties with that. The problem will be with goods and services, commerce.
Mr. Ahern.
No, the common travel area, it's worked. Even though somebody told me at a conference last week that somebody in the European Commission said that the common travel area that we had prior to 73 was consolidated into the European Union Acts, and it doesn't apply. But if that is the case, I don't know if it is, but there was a Commission person quoted as under legal people. But if it is, I think we can reenact it anyway as it used to be. Hopefully the negotiation of EU citizens will be resolved. I think it might be difficult, but because people have a tough line on immigration and how they can move around, I don't see it mightn't be that easy. Non-EU citizens maybe using Ireland, to travel. It's not a big issue today. I'm sure it'll have to be covered in the negotiations, but I really think that us opening up a border, that if we have customs and tariffs and whatever, bad enough, but if we start building it around people in any form, you can see the difficulties, and that would be a huge concern I'd have within what is a good peace process, but how you could start undermining that. Because our history, you don't have to go too far back to know how customs posts were used in the 50s and 60s as a target for these issues. So I really think these things have to be taken into account in negotiations, but hopefully they won't become an issue.
I don't want to interpose at length, but I think we've not covered it in another question. We did hear evidence last week, which I think we found interesting, about cross-border services, for example. I mean, both in terms of planning health provision and enabling people to go to hospital across the border because it's more cost effective for specialist treatment or for emergency treatment. And I imagine that's an element that you would both have in mind.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you heard it last week, but if you have in the Northwest, with a lot of the programs that have been developed and devised around education, and the Northwest, which is, I would argue, I think to John Bruton and I, that maybe over the years, through the difficulties and the troubles and economic troubles, that they didn't get all the resources that they required. They are working well together. Counties Donegal and Derry, and what they call the Omagh region, or Strabane, are working fairly well together to try and develop cross-border services for hospitals, for preschools, for training, for all kinds of schemes. Europe have been very generous, I think, in all those schemes in funding many of them. So it would be terrible to unravel these things that have been devised over the last 20 years or 25 years.
I think the fundamental issue in respect of provision of services is whether you have compatible regulations and standards governing those services on both sides of the border or both sides of the channel. So long as the standards are compatible, there isn't, I think, a problem with services being provided on a cross-border basis, whether it be for hospitals or otherwise. But if, for example, we get into a situation where you have very different rules in regard to pension provision in Northern Ireland as part of the UK than you have in the Republic of Ireland as part of the European Union, that may make difficulties for cross-border employment because pension entitlements may vary. Another area is in respect of veterinary standards or standards of plant health. If leaving the European Union, the UK decides it's going to adopt different standards in respect of the safety of food products or the safety of plants or whatever, then that, even without a tariff, could interfere with trade. And I think that the debate here is missing the fact that what the EU really is a common rule-making and rule-enforcing system. And if you leave that, you cease to have the assurance that your standards are compatible with the standards that are being applied within it. And that's the thing that are going to have to watch very carefully when it comes, for instance, to the Great Repeal Act, when standards, rules that are part of the current EU corpus of law, which are applying here in the UK, are being repealed or not reenacted in exactly the same wording on here than the one that applies in Ireland, that you're going to have a lot of very busy lawyers looking for problems here. And it's going to pose quite a difficulty, I expect, for this House and for the other House.
Thank you. Baroness Browning.
Thank you. I think you've actually answered both questions that I was going to ask you, but it was really to do with the cross-border arrangements in the event that the UK doesn't remain a member of the customs union, and the point that has just been raised about the single market regulatory measures. Can you envisage a situation, particularly in those practical areas for food, because we're aware that there are some food production which takes place across both sides of the border in order to produce the finished product. And is it likely that Ireland would find itself in difficulty with the EU regulations because of if the UK regulations change or don't keep up, for instance?
In a word, yes.
It's a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we need to watch it. Thank you. Any follow-up? Or you? Perhaps there's one little question. I was hinting at it delicately earlier. Would it be a smuggler's charter?
I live slightly nearer to the border than Bertie Ahern, so only slightly. So my constituency at one point was only, I think, 12 miles from the border, so I feel qualified. Yes is the answer to that question too.
Baroness Armstrong on
Can
that.
I just follow up something that both of you have alluded to? As I understand it, and this was one of the things that I hadn't realised before I was in Dublin and Belfast last week, part of the devolution provisions of the Good Friday Agreement come into a bit of anxiety that, for example, you were talking about workers' rights and what the European Union has agreed in the Great Repeal Bill. If the competence for them comes back to London and they change it before it goes back over to Belfast to be devolved, because technically it's a devolved area under the Good Friday Agreement, then they would have to get agreement between the two, between both sides in the Belfast Assembly in order to either revert to what they did have or improve them or whatever. And so some people have said to us that is a real issue in terms of how the Good Friday Agreement is and what decisions the government take about devolution, even if that is meant to be a temporary thing or a transitional thing. And I just wondered what your views about that were.
Well, I think in devolution, it was easy enough when everyone was in Europe, because it tended to be you worked off of European legislation or European directives in the vast majority of areas. Hopefully it won't become a problem. If an employer maybe started arguing what their rights were with some directive from Westminster, and they said this issue isn't devolved anymore. I mean that you have to follow what the laws of this house and the other houses. But hopefully we won't. I'd hate to think we'd we'd get into that. But, you know, the difficulty is trying to be optimistic about it, but there's the whole European legal model is based on directives. It's a whole legal base of many decades, where the UK government, the Irish government have signed up to. Sometimes maybe dragged, sometimes very willing, but you know that's been the basis of how we've operated, and it's the basis of how employment law and equality law. If I'm sure yesterday's meeting by the devolution administrations was to try and start teasing out these issues, and I'm sure the question they were asking is, are we going to hold everything to whenever the period of a non-EU member comes into play? I have to say, as we all know here, none of these questions have been attempted to be answered, and I'm not saying they should have been by now, but there'll be very important questions over the next 18 months or so.
I suppose there is a fear, but this is a matter entirely for the UK itself, that the Great Repeal Act and what flows from that could represent a re-centralisation of power in Westminster to the disadvantage of the various devolved administrations. And something that may also happen in a not completely transparent fashion. But then that's entirely a matter for the United Kingdom. I do think as well, and I'm agreeing with what Bertie Ahern has just said, that uncertainty is the enemy of commerce, and legal uncertainty is even more the enemy of commerce. And the extent to which this creates new uncertainties about what the rules are is going to be quite injurious to all of us. So anything that can be done to maximise certainty should be done.
Thank you. Lord Green.
And to look at other sectors, we've talked a good deal about agriculture and food processing. There are, of course, other things traded between the Republic and the UK. In particular, the Republic is a big importer of UK manufactured goods. So I have two questions. One is, are there other sectors that are particularly on the radar screen in Dublin as being sensitive and difficult ones that we need to ensure that we focus on as the British government moves towards formulating its negotiating position? And then secondly, if I may, the Japanese put out from the foreign minister, Japanese foreign minister, a very detailed memorandum on the impact of Brexit potentially on the car industry in this country, because of course they're big investors in the car industry. This was a 15-page memorandum. I'm not aware of whether any Irish group, whether it's a business group or the government itself, has done the same in detail for agriculture and food processing. I wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea to think about doing that. I'm not sure how many people in the Department of BrExit or in the Trade Department here in the government have focused, for example, on the fact that you quoted that 84% of the poultry sold through Tesco comes from the Republic.
Yeah, I think the other areas, I mean, I'm sure you heard last week, but just to repeat, apart from the agriculture, Northern Ireland still has a very good manufacturing base, traditional manufacturing base, which they supply into the Republic, and that's obviously an area that's affected. The other one, of course, that we haven't really touched on, if you look at the amount of government agencies and public bodies and private sector companies and farming community, the funding they receive from Europe today, whether it's common agricultural policy, whether it's ERDF money, whether it's the European Social Fund money, Maritime Fisheries Fund. I mean, there's a lot of these companies and agencies. I think the figure they quoted you last week, if I read correctly, was almost 10% of their economy is directly coming. It's what happens that. It's a lot of money. I know in the debate on the referendum, people said, oh, of course, that money will be replaced by exchequer money. But I'm sure there'll be somebody down the Treasury, when they start adding it up, they realise that's a problem. And I must say I worry about that, because a lot of these programmes are, there's the Peace 4 programmes, which you could argue it's not economically maybe a great programme that will stand up to the criteria of modern day economics, but it's a very important Interreg programmes, the cross-border programmes. So there's a whole host of these issues which are very important. And, our friends in the executive are working to try and make and move Northern Ireland away from being a public sector economy, rightly so, to a business economy, but that takes time. And a lot of these programmes, European programmes, are helping them in that process, in science and technology and innovation and R&D programmes. So I'd include them as a concern going forward, along with just what we consider pure industrial problems.
That's right. I think it's important also to stress that a lot of work is being done which could be defunded indirectly or directly as a result of this, to promote better community relations in some of the most deprived communities in Northern Ireland, and that could be put at risk by the financial retrenchment that may be necessitated. Bertie has already referred to Northern Ireland farmers and what they could lose, which could be very, very substantial. But I think we should also perhaps refer to the fact that the fisheries negotiation will be very difficult. Demarcating the fishing rights of the two jurisdictions will pose a lot of problems. Currently, a lot of the research that's done in British and Irish universities is funded by the European Union, and it is easiest, because of language, for British and Irish universities to cooperate with one another. If Britain is no longer in the European Union, its universities may be excluded from those programmes, which will mean that Irish universities seeking partners for research projects will have to go further afield, which will be a difficulty. But I think it will be nothing to the difficulty that will be experienced by British universities losing this source of funds. I think it's also important to say to Green that studies have been done prior to the decision in the referendum on agriculture. Teagasc, the Irish Research and Advisory Service for Farmers, produced a report earlier this year, which is not perhaps as blunt as the Japanese study, but it does contain some pretty interesting and useful information. But clearly we will need to do more in this respect. I would also mention energy. The Northern Ireland and the Republic are a single electricity market. We're a single wholesale market, and we operate our retail market as a single market voluntarily, and all of that is done within an EU framework. If you have different energy regulations now applying in one part of Ireland to that which applies in Northern Ireland, that will be difficult. Ireland is a net importer of energy from the United Kingdom, but interestingly enough, Northern Ireland is a net importer of energy from the Republic of Ireland. So, this is going to be pretty complicated. Our pharmaceutical industry could also be affected. I don't quite understand this, but I'm told that there will be issues about duties and value-added tax and all of that, which could complicate the situation. Obviously, the European Medicines Agency will not continue to be in the United Kingdom, but we would, I think, both of us be of the opinion that it should continue to operate in a country where at least the second language is English, if not the first language. I think we would agree. We mightn't agree exactly where in that country it should be located, but we could both agree on that. So there are going to be a lot, and that will of course be a disruption. The moving any institution which is up and running to another country is going to slow down all sorts of approval processes and the like. So it's going to be quite difficult. The open skies aviation issue is another matter. The EU Open Skies programme may affect what UK airlines can do in terms of picking up passengers in one EU country and bringing them to another EU country, which hasn't begun, I think, to be thought about.
That's really Stephen. Would you like to come back?
The Japanese memorandum was, to use the word blunt, it was blunt and detailed, and I know that it was read extensively in the various departments of the UK government as it starts to grapple with what Brexit really means, and opened a few eyes. So I just leave that thought.
Yes.
The reflection.
Unfortunately, it was after the
I think we can move on at this point to Baroness Armstrong, Good Friday in relation.
Okay, you have both talked a good deal about the Good Friday Agreement, and I've been particularly asking questions about the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. I think we were told last week that no one is thinking of going back to violence, but on the other hand, there is still fragility in the relationships sometimes between the two communities and in the culture. So I wanted to ask you really what you thought were the practical things that need to be done to make sure that the Good Friday Agreement retains its integrity, really, and is not put at risk.
I don't think anybody is contemplating, other than a very small group of dangerous people, but all of the issues of the past are in the past. But really the concern now is that, having had a stable situation for the best part of 20 years, the economy developing, investment coming in, investment from other parts of the United Kingdom, from the Republic of Ireland, from around the world, that this is all helping the employment position. Of course, when people are working, people are happier, and they're more people in Northern Ireland were being educated at home rather than what was happening during the years of the Troubles. So all of these uncertainties, that the point that John Bruton made earlier on, that the uncertainties are not suggesting they lead to disorder or community troubles or anything like that. I just don't see that. But it does lead to tensions within the executive, within the assembly, between north and south. So it's all of these issues. So hopefully when we get to after Easter, when the negotiations start and somebody has a framework down of what can be resolved, where people are actually talking about things, and it gets a constructive debate. It's always better, I think, when issues are on the table. It's this period that we'll have to put up with for the winter and the spring, where nearly everything we're saying is hypothetical. Everything everyone is saying is hypothetical. We think this will happen, or we think that will happen. We don't think this will happen. So until we can try and move that on, because it is putting tensions. But I think the executive and the assembly, and generally the Irish government and political system and the whole island of Ireland, I think are just hoping nobody is happy. Nobody is happy, and I don't know anybody really that's happy that the United Kingdom is pulling out of Europe. I can't think of one person, and that's, we collectively know a good few people, but I just don't see them. So I was involved in a voting situation this time last year in Newry, where there was a debate in the north and everybody was giving out the machine. 94% voted that the United Kingdom would stay in. Now, I know when it got into the vote, it wasn't that vote. So I think it's the uncertainty and the issues. I really can't see any violence or related problems at community things. I think it's about getting on with the detailed negotiations, and we are where we are, unfortunately, but we are where we are, and now we have to get on with it. But as the issues that we both have thrown out just shows, and we're just talking about the island of Ireland. I think, I'm sure you got this last week, and I'm sure you've got it elsewhere when you've been in other countries. The complexity of this is a nightmare, and we might as well face that fact.
I think we shouldn't, at the same time, underestimate the damage that negative symbolism can have as a generator of violence. Violence, Republican violence didn't arise, or loyalist violence for that matter, in Northern Ireland in pursuit of a practical programme or in objection to practical measures that were disliked. They arose from a sense of being disregarded, from a sense of symbolic issues being alien, presented in a way that was alien. And I think, therefore, the way in which this is handled, the words that are used, whatever notices are published about what's going to happen, take account of these sensitivities and avoid negative symbolism. I think it is important also to say that one person, at least, was murdered this year in Northern Ireland as a result in terrorist violence, Adrian Ismay. And we shouldn't forget that that has happened even this year. So we have to be very, very careful about this. And anyway, that's all I have to say about it.
Thank you for that. Can I pursue what you might call the legal point on this as well? Do you want to give us an appreciation of whether there are any legal consequences of Brexit for the Good Friday Agreement, given that it is based on the premise that the guarantors are both EU member states? And when that, as it were, prior condition is no longer fulfilled, will it make any difference either to the validity or expression of that agreement? Can it be sorted?
Well, you can unpick anything with legal minds, as we all know, but there are several references, and the EU dimension comes up 4 or 5 times in the Good Friday Agreement, as we've both said earlier on. So I think there has to be an understanding. The best way, I think, of dealing with this is that there, within the councils, between the governments, between British Irish Council, North-South Ministerial Council, that these issues are dealt with, and we get just a new understanding of those issues. I don't see them, quite frankly. They're there, and they've particular references, and it was European Union in mind, and one of them, I think it was the North-South Ministerial Council, or it's a British Irish one, that says the forum should be used where there are differences on EU matters. Now, I think it was more about where there might be conflict between the United Kingdom government and the Irish government over something at EU level, how we would handle that at a various council, rather than, because we tend, not always, but we tended to work very closely together on most issues down through the years. That certainly, I think both of us were there. So I hope that they're not, but they can't just be ignored. I hope they're not creating difficulties, but I hope they're not just ignored either. There needs to be an understanding of how some of these issues can be dealt with. There is the point, but that John Bruton raised at the start. There is the point about the European Convention of Human Rights. That issue has been raised, and that is an issue.
Thank you.
The European Convention on Human Rights is, in effect, the written constitution of Northern Ireland, as far as the activities of the devolved administration are concerned. They may not do anything that's in conflict with the European Convention. They are required to have a committee of the Assembly to vet legislation. for compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights. So that's critical. But of course, while that isn't in question as in the issue of Britain leaving the European Union, so long as it doesn't leave the European Convention on Human Rights. But I can't see, I must say, in the Good Friday Agreement any legal impediment, a legal problem, but other, more advanced legal minds may find something.
Those exchanges very
One thing
helpful.
I'd like to say, I'm sorry. Bertie has referred to the North-South Ministerial Council, the British Irish Council, and also the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference. I think these should be seen in part as sort of safety valves for different difficulties. I think one of the very good things about the Anglo-Irish Agreement when it came into existence first was that when some incident occurred, and the negotiations between Britain and the European Union are going to become quite fraught at some various points, and people may be inclined to say things on either side of the channel here that would be disobliging or seen as disobliging on the other side. The existence of these councils means that they don't have to say them off the spur of their moment, but they can say, well, I'm going to bring this matter up at the next meeting of the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference, or I'm going to seek a meeting of the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference to discuss these matters. Because in that way, you buy time, you get us into a situation where whatever issue it is that has been a source of difference between Dublin and London, or Dublin and Belfast, can be discussed somewhere else in a week's time when tempers have cooled. So I think we should use these institutions and regard them, and Bertie was directly involved in framing them, use them in that fashion as a means of diminishing the tensions that will inevitably arise.
Thank you. We've got about 3 questions and just up to 15 minutes to resolve them, if that's all right for you, gentlemen. Lord Whitting.
Yes, we've referred to various aspects of EU funding which go to Northern Ireland, agriculture, and some cross-border services, etc. There are. We were told when we were in Belfast and indeed in Dublin that some of that funding, because of the legal head it comes under for the EU, would not, for cross-border issues, both in terms of services, of charitable organisations, but also in terms of infrastructure, would not be available were one of the sides of the border not to be in the EU. For example, on the infrastructure side, the A5 Western Corridor. Now, if that is the case, would you see those initiatives being in jeopardy, or would you see an Irish-British deal, bearing in mind that you would no longer get the EU funds, at least under that heading?
Well, if we just mentioned one that I was deeply involved in, it's the Peace 4 initiative. I'm sure that's the one that we're talking about because I know it's very dear to them. But in the present round, the European Union allocated 150 million up until the 2020 period, and the total of that is something like close enough to 250 million. The British government and the Irish government pay the remainder. The programme would be fairly ineffective if the EU resources wasn't there, and that's quite bluntly, John Bruton mentioned earlier on about the that EU research, the 70 EU research, that's again a big fun. The Erasmus programme, which is very important, the Horizon programme, and there are a lot of them now. I know some people say they've too many of them, but they're there and they play very important roles and they play a big part of the economy. But they're all in jeopardy. To answer your question, they're all in jeopardy.
I think EU funds are going to be more scarce anyway, as a result of one of the wealthier countries in the European Union and one of the bigger contributors leaving. So, but I would expect that a change in the status of Northern Ireland from being part of the EU to not being part of the EU is bound to affect.
And what would be the consequences for they were putting quite a lot of value on these cross-border initiatives in improving the relationship between the North and the South and in community relationships?
Obviously, both governments are going to have to look at this, because we will have a shared interest in ensuring that the community benefits are achieved to the maximum extent. But both governments are going to be in a much less good financial position to do this in the absence of EU funds, and that's unfortunately a reality, and maybe one of the reasons why people in Northern Ireland took a different view to people on this island.
Lord Taoiseach.
Slightly different question, but both of you have got to the top of the political and parliamentary process in Ireland. You're both hugely respected statesmen on a European level. I just wondered, given the fact that you're no longer actively involved in Irish politics, what advice you would give the British Cabinet in its how it approaches the negotiations with the other 27?
I must say I've thought a lot about that. I think the debate here in the UK has been conducted, and even within government, about what the UK would do in approaching the negotiations we conducted, as if it was all about what's good for the UK.
Yeah.
In my view, the best way to get anything done in Europe is to present what's good for you in a fashion that is demonstrably good for the whole of Europe. And that requires obviously a lot more imagination. It's very easy to see what's good for yourself. It's very difficult sometimes to know what's in this for Slovenia, what's good about this for Spain, what's good about this for Lithuania. But the negotiating bid, so to speak, when it is made in March or whenever it is made, should, in my view, be framed as what Britain wants to do to help the European Union prosper and also the United Kingdom to prosper, rather than a series of demands that are based on what would appeal to people in Peterborough or Sunderland alone.
Mr. Ahern.
Yeah, I think, the debate is over, and like every political debate, it can create a huge amount of rancour. But I think now it's into a very different plane. And if I could say, I think the British government, by their 5th biggest exporter in the world, they're the 2nd in the EU, so they're the 10th in merchandise, 2nd in commercial. You don't have to prove anything in the size or in the scale, or it's a hugely significant country in world terms. The negotiations that the UK want to be totally isolated from everybody, of course it doesn't. I mean, the election is over. The discussions are going on with Europe, with dealing with the trade agreement with America, with the ASEAN countries, with Mercosur countries. Does the UK really want to negotiate all of them on their own? Is there not some way of the EU running these negotiations, but having a relationship with the UK and working with them in dealing with some of these issues on a world scale? It's not just Europe, they're world issues. If the world goes that the EU are negotiating all these things, and if the UK go off and negotiate them, everyone is going to be weaker. And I don't see much sense in that. And I would hope out of this, as much as I dislike the result, but that's gone. As I said several times, we are where we are. And I think now it must be getting the UK into a position, and Europe getting into a position, where they might not be collectively all around the table every day of the week as it's been, but that they have clear understandings about where they stand with in a broad umbrella, where it's the EU, stroke the UK, with relationship with India, with America, because I don't see how it'll all work otherwise. And the UK don't have to be apologetic about all these things. They're a very strong place, and it's about, will your strength be proved by being alone and fighting off everyone, or will your strength be proved by having relationship in the areas that are appropriate? And the only one that can decide that is the UK government. I would imagine, having watched the debate and the closeness of the debate, to be far more UK people happy with that than the alternative, but maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you. Two final questions. Lord Selkirk, thanks.
I express great appreciation that both former Taoiseachs have come to speak to us today, and I vividly remember Mr. Bertie Ahern speaking to the Scottish Parliament in an address of encouragement to all the new MSPs, amongst whom I was one, on 20th June 2001, and that was very much appreciated then. May I ask a question about the impact of BrExit on cross-border policing and security cooperation? What impact is BrExit likely to have on this cooperation? How can any negative impacts be mitigated? And will BrExit present any impediment to the sharing of evidence and immigration data, cooperation in extradition, tackling organised crime and terrorism, and cross-border investigations and emergencies? That's rather a lot to ask in one question.
Yes. Well, I chaired the committee in the convention which drafted the Lisbon Treaty, which dealt with the issue of justice and security cooperation. And it provides, those treaty provisions provide an immense resource for cooperation between EU countries on matters like the European arrest warrant, the establishment of Europol, the sharing of evidence, the mutual recognition of evidence, the sharing of intelligence, all of those matters which are very, very important, not just on a cross-border basis, but between the UK and Ireland, and between the UK and the rest of the European Union. Initially, I think it was the case that the UK authorities were quite suspicious of these provisions and wanted to opt out of them completely, but when they actually saw how they were working, they decided that they wanted to opt into some of them. Now, I expect that the rest of the European Union would welcome it, even if Britain is leaving the European Union, that it would opt into as much of this, because as long as there is relatively free movement, and there will be relatively free movement between the UK and the rest of the EU anyway, we need to have very strong intelligence cooperation, legal cooperation for the detection and deterrence of crime. And my sense is that I would encourage the United Kingdom to not to depart from this. Now, obviously, there are going to be issues, and this is speaking very openly, that cause me concern. If the UK decides that for all purposes it's going to have nothing to do with the European Court of Justice, that can lead to difficulties then in cooperation, because there has to be some final arbiter if there's a dispute in some area like this. And for us, the final arbiter is the European Court of Justice. So, on a case-by-case, sector-by-sector basis, given the importance of dealing with terrorism, not just terror, all forms of reasons for terrorism, that the UK should seek to proactively continue to opt in as much as possible to this. Now, obviously, that will be subject to negotiation. But I can't see much objection from our EU colleagues to the UK continuing to participate in this, because this will be good for all of us.
Mr. Ahern.
Well, listen, trying to defeat crime, organised crime, international crime. We all know it's a cross-border issue, it's a cross-the-world issue, and everybody should be trying to cooperate. So I would hope that, answer your question, I'd hope everyone would agree with that. But I have to say, your ministers at European Council meetings, and was there a long time, tended to be fairly negative against all of these issues for reasons that I couldn't quite understand most of the time. And I politely say that if they continued that attitude that they had when they were in Europe, I'm not too sure I could even guess what they'll be like when they're out of Europe. And that would be my concern, and I'm afraid the European Court of Justice, I know there's a major hang-up about it, and I'm afraid in Europe it's seen as a very positive thing.
Thank you. I think Lord Kinnaird to ask the final.
Thank you, Chairman. The Irish government published its contingency plan immediately after the referendum, and identified a number of key issues, 3 in particular. They've given a very effective storm warning on the energy market already. I wondered whether you could flesh out your thoughts on social welfare provision and cross-border health services.
Well, on the health, on the cross-border health, I mean, the North-South Ministerial Councils have been working and have made a lot of progress in that area. I'm sure you heard last week of the success that they're very proud of the cancer services and what they've done on an all-island basis, and I think it's very good. They've also been cooperating in obstetrics, and you know, they've made again a lot of progress in this area. So hopefully those things can continue, because they're really based on the medical professions and the people working together. But there can be difficulties in other areas. I'm not sure the cooperation might be as strong in other ways. But I'd hope that the North-South Ministerial Council is still there, and you know, can continue to work. The energy, John, I think is what was the third one that you mentioned?
Social welfare.
The social welfare. Well, you know, we have taken different views on social welfare debate over the last number of years. We have a large European workforce now, and we have, you know, been fairly committed to following the European codes. It creates some tensions and some problems, but we haven't had the same difficulties you had about the reciprocal arrangements that are there. We've had reciprocal arrangements all the way from 1973, and they've evolved and developed. Now I know some of them are open to some rancour and to some difference, but to the best of my knowledge, we haven't opted out of any of the social welfare codes over the last number of years.
Yeah. Broadly, I agree with what's just been said. Obviously, there are far more people from the Republic working in Northern Ireland, and far more people from Northern Ireland working in the Republic now than was the case, say, 20 years ago. And that is going to raise issues about social welfare entitlements if and when they get sick or unemployed and all of that. So I think we need to work very, very hard at finding practical solutions to any difficulties that arise. I think it's also important that in making any changes to existing rules that are EU rules, that when that is being contemplated by government departments here in London in 4 or 5 or 6 years' time, or 7 years' time, or whenever it is that the Repeal Act is brought into force, that a very a requirement is made that the cross-border impact of this of any change be looked at, the cross-border Irish impact of any change at all in the community acquis that might be contemplated under the powers of the Repeal Act, that's sort of required to be one of the considerations that's looked at before any change is made. And in that way, practical solutions can be found. The North-South Ministerial Council, or whatever body it is, has time to find a solution. The last thing I think we'd want is some decision made on some particular EU law that makes an awful lot of sense in London, but doesn't make an awful lot of sense in Derry or Newry.
Thank you for that. Finally, is there anything that we haven't touched on tonight that either of you would want to draw to our attention? No.
I think we've thrown it up.
You are very eloquent. If I may say, trying to encapsulate this extraordinarily rich exchange of views, for which we are very grateful. It seems to me that maybe one of the messages we ought to be reflecting on is the maximum acceptable degree of flexibility to meet the needs of people on both sides of this frontier that we have historically, and which has been so much, shall we say, its effects have been mitigated by the European Union, which we will no longer be a member of. And secondly, the simple point that probably when Britain leaves, we will continue not only to need, but actually to ramp up our bilateral relationships so we can talk these things through. But you have been immensely grateful and gracious with your time. You've given us huge insights, and it will immensely help the deliberations of our committee, and we're very grateful, and you will be more than welcome to share any further thoughts with us, or I'm sure to come and see us on a future occasion, as this has now become a double act which we have enjoyed, treasured, and for which we're very grateful. Thank you. The committee, and you don't often get that from one of our committees, say off the record. The formal public session is now concluded. I'll just go and thank the guests and remind colleagues that we'll need to clear the gallery and just have a short deliberative session in a moment. Thank you.